Let's dive into the evolution of Cambodia's constitutional amendments. From those early, almost ceremonial tweaks in the wake of conflict, to the consolidation of power we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these amendments really mirror the political shifts in the country, right?
Absolutely. You see, right after the peace process of the early 90s, when the country was emerging from a long civil war, the Constitution was basically a pact among elites aiming for power sharing, even if things were pretty fragile.
So initially, these amendments were less about power grab and more about, ironing out inconsistencies and managing coalition governments.
Exactly. The first amendments, for instance, dealt with adjustments like delegating the king's power to an interim head of state when needed, which might sound ceremonial but was critical to maintaining smooth governance in a delicate post-conflict setting.
Right, and it's interesting how even minor procedural tweaks had a huge role in stabilizing that power-sharing agreement between parties like the CPP and FUNCINPEC.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And then as time went on, we see these amendments branching into three main strands. First, we have the ceremonial ones, which were largely technical, like clarifying the delegation of powers in cases of the king's absence or medical issues.
Yeah, those amendments seem almost like housekeeping, ensuring that the constitutional machinery could operate without a hitch.
For sure. Then there's the second strand, the power sharing and consensus building amendments. These were born out of political deadlocks, like when disagreements after elections forced a resolution to form coalition governments. They, you might say, were compromises between actors who distrusted each other.
And wasn't the creation of the Senate, transforming the unicameral legislature into a bicameral one, a prime example of that compromise?
Absolutely, that's a great example. The Senate was set up after a standoff between CPP and FUNCINPEC, essentially creating additional seats so both parties could share power.
However, it's really intriguing how quickly those consensus-building mechanisms began to erode, right?
Exactly. After a point, especially post-2014, the amendments began shifting focus. They started to consolidate power rather than build consensus. Think about the amendments passed after 2015, which effectively dismantled the very rules that allowed for power sharing.
Yeah, it really marks a clear political pivot, almost a descent into outright authoritarianism, doesn't it?
Indeed. Recent amendments, particularly those passed in 2018 onward, have been about cementing the CPP's hegemony. They weren't just about resolving a stalemate anymore, they actively restrained political opposition by, for example, providing constitutional justifications for dissolving opposition parties.
Right. And it seems like, with these changes, the process of amending the Constitution itself shifted from being a legislative-led procedure to something more driven by the executive branch and even the Prime Minister, correct?
That's spot on. Originally, amendments were largely driven from the National Assembly, a reflection of coalition negotiations. But in later amendments, proposals started coming from the Council of Ministers and the Prime Minister, which really sped up the process of power consolidation.
I find it almost ironic that the amendments designed to keep the peace in a post-conflict society eventually became the tools for undermining the democratic norms that were originally intended.
Right. Absolutely. It's quite a paradox. On one hand, the Constitution was meant to enshrine principles like liberal, multi-party democracy and constitutional monarchy. On the other, over time, the amendments have increasingly focused on disenfranchising opposition voices and streamlining power.
And not just that, but even the role of the king and the so-called Constitutional Council are interesting here. I mean, originally the king had a role that was mostly ceremonial, but then the consultation process with the Constitutional Council essentially added a layer of symbolic oversight that hardly ever blocked amendments.
Right, exactly. The king's consultation was designed as a safeguard, but in practice, it rarely resulted in any amendment being rejected. Instead, it ended up serving as a formality in a process where political elites dominated.
Speaking of safeguards, what do you think about the so-called eternity clauses that try to lock in certain fundamental principles like democratic governance, but then later get, effectively sidelined by later amendments?
That's a really critical point. Those clauses were meant to protect the system's core values, but as amendments evolved, especially those emulating models from neighboring authoritarian regimes, even those basic structures have been twisted. It's like the system promised to safeguard democracy, but then the amendments make it easier for the dominant party to further centralize power.
And in a way, this borrowing from models in other authoritarian states, like Thailand's amendments in some cases, or even China's constitutional language, really underlines that shift, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. There's clear evidence that later amendments took inspiration from constitutional models that favor central control and limit dissent. For instance, the restrictions on dual citizenship for holding key offices seem to echo practices in other authoritarian contexts.
Right. And that, of course, disproportionately affected political opposition, especially those with international ties, which is a deliberate move to marginalize adversaries.
Exactly. The impact of those amendments went beyond mere procedural adjustments. They effectively restricted who could participate at the highest levels of government.
I also find it interesting how amendments answered immediate political crises. In moments of electoral disputes or post-election deadlocks, they were the go-to tool to avert, say, a governmental crisis, even if that meant bypassing established constitutional processes.
Yes, like the Additional Constitutional Law of 2004, for example. That amendment, while controversially bypassing normal procedures, allowed the parties to finally form a government during a standoff.
But it also signaled the beginning of the end for the era of consensus, the moment when power sharing was effectively replaced by mechanisms that solidified CPP dominance, correct?
Exactly. It marked the transition from a constitution that was a product of, negotiated settlement post-conflict to one that increasingly reflected and reinforced a single-party rule.
And then there's the whole role of procedural changes. The fact that earlier amendments required a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly, but more recent ones have shifted to an absolute majority vote, really tells us about the changing landscape of political power.
It does. Those procedural relaxations have essentially paved the way for a smoother, almost automatic consolidation of power by the ruling party.
Right. Now, one thing I find a bit troubling is how these amendments, while seemingly technical, have deep political ramifications. I mean, shifting how a premier is selected or how government votes are conducted might sound mundane, but these changes secure a dynastic succession, like the move to ensure Hun Mane's rise.
Absolutely. It's like the amendments aren't just about governance. They're also about, cementing a family dynasty. It's a deliberate strategy to prevent challenges both from outside and within the party itself.
However, I do want to challenge one point. Some might argue that these amendments are simply modernizing the constitutional process for today's realities. But doesn't that ignore the fact that they're stripping away essential protections for multi-party democracy?
Precisely. And that's where the critique lies. While it's true that any constitution should be adaptable, these changes seem less about modernization and more about sidelining dissent and entrenching a single-party dynastic rule.
And if you step back, it's striking how the amendment practice in Cambodia tells a broader story not just of political evolution, but of a retreat from the democratic aspirations that were part of the original peace agreements in the early 90s.
Exactly. The process started as a way to manage power sharing in a post-conflict transitional era, but ended up being transformed into a tool for re-autocratization. This shift is a window into how constitutional texts can be repurposed to reflect and even facilitate political power shifts over time.
It's a reminder that constitutions, while often seen as immutable legal documents, are really living texts that evolve with the political dynamics of their time.
Right. And while the Cambodian constitution has only seen, about 10 or 11 amendments over 3 decades, those changes, both procedural and substantive, have huge implications. They mirror the slow unraveling of a coalition-based order into an authoritarian system.
Yep. And that makes you wonder, what lessons can be drawn for other post-conflict societies? Clearly, an initial emphasis on consensus can later be undermined by elites seeking to secure their power permanently.
Exactly. It's a cautionary tale, one where the very constitution that was designed to foster democracy ends up being used to dismantle it from within.
Wow, it's a deep dive into how legal frameworks can transform political realities. I mean, the interplay between formal constitutional rules and actual power dynamics is truly, eye-opening.
Absolutely, and that's why understanding amendment practice in Cambodia is critical. It not only reveals the mechanics of constitutional change, but also how law itself becomes a tool in the hands of the powerful to reshape governance and, ultimately, society.
And, as always, it shows that constitutions are never just about law. They're political documents that reflect the struggles, compromises, and sometimes betrayals inherent in power.
Exactly. Whether it's the technical ceremonial amendments or the sweeping consolidatory changes to secure dynastic succession, each amendment tells a part of the story of Cambodia's post-conflict evolution, from a tentative coalition to a firm, centralized rule.
Right. It's a reminder that behind all those legal phrases and procedural details, there's a very human story of political maneuvering and shifting alliances.
Absolutely. And while Cambodia's constitutional journey might be unique, it also offers broader insights into the fragility of post-conflict settlements and the ways in which legal frameworks can both preserve and undermine democratic norms.
Truly. Well, this has been a really engaging conversation about how constitutional amendments in Cambodia provide a window into political transformation and consolidation. Thanks for walking through all these intricacies with me.
Thank you, indeed. It's been a fascinating deep dive, and there's always more to explore on how law and power interact.